Daniela, I'm glad to see you tonight. We've got a great show lined up and been looking forward to this for a while. But Daniela, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, and I think great timing for a talk about purity culture as
Yeah.
everyone's going off for holidays with all of their families and all of the things that have
hmm
just happened.
And joining us tonight is Maddie Jo Cowsert. And did I get the last name correct?
You did. Nailed it. It's very phonetic. People are afraid to say cow, but it is in the name. Yeah.
Fantastic. And she is the author of God, Sex, and Rich People. And I recently read this book, and I can't say enough good things about the book. Maddie, I am thrilled to have you. I appreciate your generosity and appreciate you writing the book. And just as way of introduction, you grew up, you were a pastor's daughter in
hmm
the heart of Jesus land, the
Yeah.
buckle of the Bible Belt, near Branson, Missouri.
hmm
And if you've ever been to Branson, it's like Las Vegas, except for Christian people, I suppose.
Yeah.
I don't know how to
Yes.
say it better, but that's
hmm
where that was your cultural context. And then through a series of events, you ended up in New York City, and wow, did your world expand rather
Yeah.
quickly. So welcome to the show. And on this
Thank
show,
you.
yeah, we talk about cults and the culting of America.
Mm.
And although you and I grew up in similar situations, evangelical America, sometimes people don't want to label it culty, but I certainly grew up in a cult. I think maybe you were a little bit more mainstream Christianity
hmm
than I was. But tell me a little bit about and the folks listening a little bit about your experience when and where you grew up.
Yeah. So, listen, something I'm really passionate about is that it's all the same. Like, it's definitely a spectrum of severity for sure. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, I was not in a polygamous compound in Texas, right? Like, I do recognize that my trauma doesn't extend to, it's not to that extent, but like I was still getting the same messages of like the FLDS women, but just in a more palatable delivery. And so it's not as obvious to the outside world because no, the pastor isn't taking, 47 wives, one of them, like three of them, between the ages of like 12 and 16. But like my whole life still centered around being married. You know what I mean? Like I wasn't taught to have a personality outside of be a wife. I wasn't taught to have a sense of self outside of the orbit of a man. So I was, you know what I mean? Like, and I almost think it's more damaging. Well, I don't want to say it's more damaging, but it is harder to excavate some of the damage when the world doesn't see it as like obvious. And because then it's harder for you to recognize it as obvious, right? So anyway, all that to be said, while I didn't grow up in a cult, like I kind of think it's all a cult. I think Christianity, my friend Sammy calls it a death cult. Like it is obsessed with death and what happens after we die, and we all are living around this fear of what happens when we die. And but I did grow up sort of like the cool Christian non-denom version of evangelical, so I did not if like Jerry Falwell did it, uh, I wasn't a fundamentalist, right? But the messaging was still similar to the Falwells, whatever. But because it was so cool and approachable, and my church had like a rock climbing wall, and the sanctuary was a gym that also was like a basketball court, and we had like spinny lights and a sick sound system, and like Super Chick performed at our church, and it's like because it was all of that, no one really recognized it as fundamentalism, and they would definitely not have considered themselves fundamentalists. But when I learned more about that, I'm like, yeah, I grew up with that sort of like all around me. So yeah, and then my dad was on staff at that church up until I went away to New York, actually. Yeah, and then I now I'm forgetting the question, but essentially I wore a purity ring. I fully bought in. It wasn't just part of my life. It was my entire life. It wasn't just part of my identity. It was my entire identity, of like being a follower of Christ, being a woman of God. And, yeah, I I I didn't ever think that that would change, right? Like I just, oh, your faith is unwavering. Like nothing will ever shake my relationship with Jesus. It might shift. I might change my mind about some things. That's okay. Well, depending on who you ask, which Bible study leader I had at the time, right? But I I don't know. I never thought I would not identify as Christian. But then I moved to New York and, like I say, my entire identity imploded thanks to Tinder and my Jewish roommate. And it was just sort of like culture shock from every angle. And it forced me to question my faith, reinvent my sexuality. And the rich people part is like all while living with and working for the 1%. So just by sort of nature of living, I deconstructed. It certainly, I didn't set out to do it.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
don't know if any of us set out to deconstruct,
Right.
right? Like for me, I'm like, I set out to not die.
Yeah.
And now 13 years later, I'm like climbing out of the decade of deconstruction.
Right.
But I want to say, Maddie, so first of all, so nice to meet you. We
So nice
definitely
to
have
meet you.
to trade books, I think, because we will both find it like very fascinating. But as what can always bring to the table is like, as one of those survivors of the bona
Mhm.
fide compound cult that
Mhm.
suffered all the abuse and had all of that stuff, like, I agree with you that it's all the same,
Mhm.
right?
Oh,
Like,
okay.
and that it doesn't matter what you call it. Like, this
Mhm.
is part of my perspective on my platform is like, look,
Mhm.
there's a reason I wrote my story first, because as you're
Mhm.
reading my story and like you're relating, like, yes,
Mhm.
which
Mhm.
is sort of
Mhm.
backwards of how I've felt in America for 20 years, knowing that I come from the extreme cult, but then relating
Mhm.
to every even, evangelical or ex-Mormon, like
Yeah.
regular kid that I talk to. And then
Right.
the other thing, that struck me as you were talking was like, people don't realize that like the cults do all that cool stuff too.
Yeah.
Like, Children of God performed at
Okay.
the White House. They were good at being
Yeah.
cool. Like they put on
Mhm.
all of this stuff, right? So like I left as a teenager, but my peers that stayed in the 2000s,
Mhm.
like they were your cool youth pastors and youth clubs and all of this sort of
Mhm.
similar stuff going on. So I
Yeah.
just wanted to, like, if you've never heard that from someone from like a, quote unquote bona fide
Mhm.
extreme cult, like, yes, I 100% agree with you that
Okay.
this is all the same stuff. And I think like coercive control is coercive control. And like the
Right.
only difference is time, money, and impunity. Like once you're a
Mhm.
full cult, like, the Scientologists, the Children of God, the FLDS, like they've gotten as bad as they've gotten
Mhm.
because they've had time, money, and impunity. But like
Yeah.
regular Mormons are a cult too. And they are
Correct.
hurting, like you were damaged in very
Mhm.
similar traumatic ways as I was growing up in
Mhm.
quote
Right.
unquote real cult.
Yeah, it's actually I have a a chapter in my book, excuse me, called Maddie Jo Meets a Mormon. And I actually had this like little rendezvous with this guy that I met in an airport who happened to be leaving the Mormon church at the time that I met him. And we stayed in touch for years. And it was really validating to meet him because I was like, I haven't met anyone who can relate to my experience yet. Like,
Yeah.
because in New York, it's not that it's not like I definitely have met people here now who have gone through it. But at the time, 2014, 2013, people weren't taught, like, evangelical did not become a household name until 2016. It was Donald Trump, right? And the rise of the evangelical following and all of that. Like, not that the religious right didn't exist before that. It has, right? We know that. But it wasn't really something the average person had a concept of until Donald Trump. And so, people in New York had no idea what I was talking about. If I talked about it, which I didn't know really how to talk about it. So when I met this Mormon guy, I was so relieved because I was like, we're speaking the same language.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
to your point, yeah.
Hilarious. The first time I met a Mormon, I was 15 in Mexico, still in the Children of God. And it basically, we were just both convincing each other that each other was in a cult. It was pretty
Yeah.
funny. To
Yeah.
years back later be like, we're not wrong. I
Mm-hmm.
have always had this experience where I'm like, I relate to Mormons, I relate to evangelicals. And I think part of it that I've realized is just like, if you have any version of a childhood where you were in the world but not of the
Of
world,
it.
right? Where I
Yes.
describe as like
We are aliens.
you were being
Yeah.
held separate from
Mm-hmm.
the culture. And what it results in, aside from all of the religious trauma, which is significant, but it
Mm-hmm.
results in this feeling of like we are basically invisible immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Where
Yeah.
we look like we fit, but like
Mm-hmm.
I'm the furthest thing from like, just like a millennial white lady from Texas as I could be
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because I wasn't growing up in the culture,
Mm-hmm.
and like
Mm-hmm.
I personally was growing up abroad for most of my cult experience, but like you said, like for you moving to New York is this giant culture shock.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Maddie, I want to bring this back to the fact that you grew up in this Jesus culture, and
Mm-hmm.
you were groomed to be a
Mm-hmm.
quote unquote woman of God. And I got to say, by the way, um, great job in writing the book. There's lots of sex in the book, but
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of humor in the book as well.
Mm-hmm.
And you talk about your relationship. I believe he was your college boyfriend,
Yeah.
and that there was a lot of back and forth there, a lot
Mm-hmm.
of drama
Mm-hmm.
and trauma too. But eventually, you broke that off because you wanted to pursue an acting career in New York City. And I
Mm-hmm.
remember one of the most hilarious lines in the entire book. Um, Dicks everywhere. Dicks. You're surrounded by dicks. All kinds of dicks in New York City. And talk a little bit about that culture shock and how that started for you, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I think the line is like I went through this situation with this like famous actor, and I was like withholding having sex with him because I wanted him to respect me and like want to pursue me as a wife. Because I was taught that's the only way to get a man to respect you is to not sleep with him. Um anyway, we'll get there. And then I did that and he still wasn't interested. And I was like, okay, well, if not sleeping with men isn't going to keep them interested, I said fuck it all and quite literally fucked it all. And I just kind of went on a rampage. And I had no standards, right? Which is a whole other thing. I call it, eventually I developed a blueprint for boning, which is basically a sexual ethic, but like I didn't in the beginning at all. So the culture shock of New York, going from date to Maryland to the city that never sleeps and never stops sleeping around. So I really genuinely thought I would marry my college boyfriend because that's just what you do. And because I loved him, like truly, he was, and I think I do a good job of that in the book. Like I was
Right.
genuinely in love with him. He was a great person. And I still think that to this day. I think he was a wonderful man. I think that he was a victim of a lot of the same narratives that I was. And so, yes, there was some harm that was done, but I don't blame him for that. If he had known better, he wouldn't have. I believe that. I believe some men in the church are not like that. They are mean-spirited and they are controlling and they are manipulative. I don't think that about my college boyfriend. And I really did like respect him. I thought he was so smart. And so I would have loved to have been his wife. But he was 2 years older than me. And I think he had a lot more perspective than I did, having gotten out of college. He was going to be going to medical school. I think he was sort of having like an identity crisis himself. And he sort of had the foresight to be like, this is not going to work. Like, you want to move to New York and you want to pursue your dreams. That is in direct conflict with what I'm going to do, which is go to med school. And because there was the, pressure of you can't have sex until you're married and everything, we would have wanted to get married right after college. And he was not going to do that. He was like, I don't think we should get married. I actually think we have a lot of incompatibility issues. So he was sort of the one who brought it to me and was like, I think we should break up. But he didn't say it. He didn't say the breakup word. I was the one who eventually was like, like classic dudes, they're just like assholes until you force their hands, right? To break up. There's like that line in Friends where they point it out to him and they're like, the girls are like, oh, are you being all distant so that we have to break up with you? And they're like, you guys know about that? And so anyways, he was saying it, but not saying it, right? And so I was the one who was finally like, you know what? I can't do this. Like, you're really breaking my heart every time you bring this up. So let's just call the whole thing off. And so we broke up over Skype, RIP. And then I went to New York like the very next day because it was my spring break. And right following that spring break, I ended up having an affair with an engaged guy. I managed to find another Christian in New York City who was an asshole and cheated on his fiance with me. Which was just like such a pendulum. Like I call it, like that was the beginning of the necessary pendulum for me. I went from like not laying down horizontally with my boyfriend of 2 years to like sleeping in the same bed with an engaged guy who's a stranger in New York. Like, so, and then once and then I came back to Missouri and I had one more year of college, but I was building it all up to move to New York. And so then once I was in New York, I was very shocked to find that like men in their 20s didn't want to get married. Like it sounds ridiculous because like duh, but I really thought where the single men are the aspiring husbands. Like that's just how it worked in my life. So that's what I thought. I would go to New York and I would just be like the husband options would befall me, right? And like that is not what happened at all. And I could barely get guys to like commit to a date, and none of them were looking to get married. I have the whole story in my book about my first Tinder date and how that went down. So embarrassing. But that was the beginning, that conversation with him, which was like, I found out he was Jewish. And then I was like, oh, he's Jewish. Oh my God, I can't date a Jew, and then the whole like equally yoked panic attack. And I was like, I never had even thought that there would be like a man in the world who didn't look Jewish. I was like, why are you not wearing a yarmulke? Don't you have something else you should be wearing that shows me you're Jewish? Like, I just didn't know anything. And then like, on a first date and date to Maryland, you exchange testimonies and you tell them how many people you've kissed. I call it the litany of lust action. You have to like get that off your chest before you can see if you're really compatible, and like, that is not what first dates in New York City were like. That would have actually been very uncomfortable had I traversed that, because I would try and then I'd backpedal. I'd be like, oh no, this is not going to go over well. And just like none of the men were behaving in ways that would, like, they were not courting me, right? And I was just like, this is so crazy. So, and then on top of that, I was living with a guy who was born and raised in New York City, a Jewish guy. I was like, another Jewish daywalker. I was like, you don't look Jewish. And then my other roommate was from India and my other roommate was from Sweden. So just from like, I had more diversity in my New York apartment than I had ever experienced in all of my time in Missouri. And even like language didn't translate. Like my joke is, if you tell people in New York you were just at a worship service, they'd be like, oh, chill, like an ayahuasca retreat. Like they don't know you're talking about Hillsong, like there were just things that didn't translate at all. And even like the infamous conversation with my roommate about Mormons, I was like, oh, I'd never date a Mormon, right? Because like Christians are just so superior to Mormons. And our beliefs are not wackadoodle at all. all. And then he says the lines of like, oh no, I get it. Christians get miracles. Everyone else gets stuff they made up. And so it was like these little things, like, and then don't even get me started on the wealth aspect. Oh my God. I was like, I cannot believe, I remember this. This did not make it into the book, but I should have included it. I told my roommate that I tithed 10% to the church. And he was like, 10%? He was like, that is a lot of money. He was like, do you calculate how much of your tax money goes to like social services in this tithe money? That like that 10%, that's a lot to go to an institution, right? And I was like, I never thought about it. And then I was like, 10% of like middle income to poor people in churches all across the country is really exploitative, like incredibly exploitative. And I had never had anyone bring that up to me before. I was like, yeah, because I was really afraid if I didn't tithe that like I would stop being blessed by the Lord. And so even as I was not even like believing, I always set aside tithing money. It was very interesting. There was a lot that was going on that was like, I didn't really buy into it, but I was still abiding by it, right? A lot of like, I didn't think that having sex before marriage made me used goods, but I did kind of think that, like subconsciously. And I was treating myself as if it was true. It was kind of like with tithing. Like I tithed for so long, even when I didn't really officially belong to a church, just because I was afraid if I didn't, I'd get punished in some way. And yeah, I just saw all of these really rich people living their best freaking lives, and none of them were religious. I was like,
this isn't keeping
yeah,
all their money.
Yeah, I was like, I mean, they're doing great. Like, what's their secret,
So much for the prosperity doctrine, right?
Exactly. And then I was like, that's so fucked. Like, prosperity gospel, it literally like, yeah, it is exploitative of people's needs and wants. And I knew people who went to prosperity gospel churches, and I judged them because I didn't think my church was like that. But now I'm like, damn, 10% is a lot. Like, if I think about how much we spend in taxes to then put another 10% on top of that, like, oh my gosh. So anyway, those were just a little bit of the culture shocks.
Yeah, and Daniela, you talked about something that I saw that you produced this week about how in a cult or a high control group or even a church like this, right? If they pass an offering plate, it's not free.
Yeah.
This is one of the things that riles me up so much, especially you get like AA talking about it all the time and in churches. And it's like, you don't understand the first about group behavior if you think that it's free, if you're passing it around, right? Like that is just social proof at work, right? Human beings are incredibly biased to it's a survival mechanism that we have, that we decide to do a lot based in part on what everyone else around us is doing, right? If you approach a stream and
100%.
everyone else is drinking from it, then probably it's safe, right? And so social proof, and then especially after we gather you together, we have you do a bunch of chanting, which makes us feel vulnerable and in sync with each other, right? And then and also makes us highly susceptible to suggestion. And then we pass around this offering plate, and it's like, this is the kind of thing that is at work. And I do really think it's a sobering moment to think about like how much money they're getting. I did this math in my cult when I was 12 years old, where I did the minimum number of people we have, minimum number that they have to send every month. Because our cult had like a minimum if your 10% was too low for them. Speaking of exploitative, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, just based on that, it is millions of dollars, and like that really, I think, can be like an important wake up moment. But another thing, when you were talking, it just struck me as like, it's almost the benefit of being in like the compound, right? Is that like when you get thrown out, like, you're out, like you just lost your whole value system, But as you were talking even about the kind of, promiscuous behavior that like same thing that I did,
Mm-hmm.
but it's like, because when you leave a cult, like it was a framework for how to live your life, right? And all of a sudden
Mm-hmm.
that framework is just gone. The only difference
Mm-hmm.
between me being dropped off in Texas at 15 from my call and like you in New York City was like, I knew my framework was gone, but you were
Mm-hmm.
kind of like slowly losing yours. And
Mm-hmm.
that's a lot, I think, a lot more of the like common deconstruction process. And just like,
Mm-hmm.
I could feel the whiplash as you were describing it.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
just
It
like,
was it was also, I was talking about this earlier with someone about sort of the anonymity of New York was the best gift that it gave me, to your point about social pressure, because when no one in New York, again, my joke is like, if no one in New York gave a fuck who I was fucking, and if I was saying fuck, who did I want to be? Because back home, once that anonymity was imparted, I realized how much of my behavior was really based in fear of judgment from others, and to be accepted by and belong, right? And then, to your point with the framework, yeah, I mean, I have a couple of like big moments where it was like, oh, this is bullshit, this is bullshit, this is bullshit. And then, but the like minutia, I didn't really tackle a lot of that. It was what much slower. So it was like I knew I was losing my framework, but I wasn't fully conscious of it. And I definitely didn't have a new framework to work off of. Right. So, I call the years that I write about in the book my rubble years, because I had knocked down a bunch of shit, but I had no idea how to rebuild from it. So I was just like, seeping in an atomic wasteland of my previous self with no idea how to like rebuild. And I didn't get there for a while. It was probably like 3 solid years before I was like, oh, I think I have to do something about this, which I also talk about in the book. But yeah, and again, it's not as obvious to everybody on the outside. And it was also particularly difficult because I had so many friends who were doing the whole evangelical married thing, and they had gotten it right. They had done everything right, and so they had gotten the husband. Clearly, I had done something wrong for my college boyfriend to not want me, to not be chosen. And I internalized that to mean that, I was unlovable, and God didn't, want to reward me for whatever reason. And then I sort of just like dug in further on that. Like, well, like if you think that was bad, let me show you, like it was just really interesting looking back how I was operating. And as I'm developing a TV show by the same title, and some of the feedback that I've gotten is that for the medium of film, you have to have an external conflict, right? Because you have to like show the conflict. And I'm like, it's so interesting because so much of my experience was an internal conflict. So I'm going to have to like work on that, because so much of the deconstruction process is an internal conflict. It's like a fear of yourself.
yeah.
And in your show, and I watched the proof of concept. By the way,
Yeah.
it's fabulous, great work.
Thank you.
But you open that up with a story that you tell in the book with your liaison with a pop star, and
Mm-hmm.
it really is comical because I can relate so much when you talk about the fact that we were conditioned, sex was this really big taboo, right? And anytime
Mm-hmm.
you talked about sex, or God forbid had sex, you certainly did not talk about it. And so you get
Mm-hmm.
involved with this pop star, and immediately afterwards he's hydrating or something like that. It's not really a big deal, and you're
Yeah.
laying there and you're like having all of this conflict internally. And
Mm-hmm.
in the television show, there's a woman. I'm not sure who the woman represents, but she's like your conscience maybe, and she's like
Yeah.
telling you how awful what you've done, and she actually has a piece of fruit that she's destroying, and she's saying, this is
With a
you, right?
pencil.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that was really eye-opening how difficult it is for those of us that are raised in that culture to assimilate. And this is why we walk
Yeah.
around so awkward and weird all the time. It's because we don't know what to say or how to act or what to do.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm glad that you picked up on that juxtaposition, because that was really important to me. Like, he is being so casual, and I'm like immediately clothing myself. Like, I didn't even take my bra off for sex. Like, and I go into the bathroom and I have this moment with God, and even while it's happening. So we actually had to like marry a few scenes for production purposes and like time and location and all of that. But she was supposed to be my first boyfriend's mom, is
Okay.
what she, like I was sharing a very innocent first kiss when I was like 14, and she comes in and she does that whole thing. But really she just represents like any church lady or like for me, my abstinence teacher, because I literally got that exact demonstration in my abstinence class. Like, much of the proof of concept, I would like to be like, I'm such a brilliant writer. I came up with this amazing. No, this is just like literally how it happened. And so that was really important to me to like show, there are some things that are fabricated for the point of like for storytelling purposes, but yeah, that the tomato
But
and
that,
the pencil stabbing, that really
let me
was
tell
the
you,
thing I learned.
this term. So there's a term for when we like all police each other and like what each other is supposed to be doing. And like, in the church, when you pull another adult aside and you counsel them, it is called, and we do it to ourselves, right? And it's called performative regulation.
Wow. Yes.
And I gift you this term because I think it's so awesome. And it's like exactly what you're describing there. And I think turning that like your self-conscious into one of the church like aunties is like, that's
Yeah.
just like
Yeah.
performative regulation.
Yes. And I mean, the pop star, yeah, just so casual. Yeah, he had to humidify. He had a
And then
concert the next day.
and then he's connecting you to his friend, right? And so all of this
Yeah.
conversation is going on immediately following sex, and
Yeah.
you nail that beautifully, because that is exactly how all of us that move away from that culture, we feel, especially about the subject of sex, and of course it's other subjects as well, but that seems to be the most obvious one.
Yeah. And I mean, to be clear, I don't think that like how he behaved was quote unquote normal at all. I think it was massively douchey. Like, even given all of the experiences I've had since, I'm like, no, he was a total tool. But in how he behaved in that moment, I have heard from others he has not evolved much. So sometimes it just happens that way.
In my head,
Like, because it's not John Mayer. It's not that cool. The best thing about this pop singer, I can't like reveal his identity, but like the best thing about him is that like he's one of those pop singers that everyone knows, but no one knows his name, which is honestly the best karma for him, because like he's successful, but no one really knows. Like, no one knows who he is, but they probably know his songs. You know what I mean? But anyways, yeah, the how to behave in sexual situations, let alone how to like carry oneself in a way that felt empowering and confident and assured. Like, forget it. You just, I mean, for so much of like my early days of having sex, I was just sort of going off of what I thought everyone else was doing. And then eventually I learned everyone else is also having really bad sex, like, which is also a problem. Like, why is everyone's just sort of playing it off like, haha, LOL, drunk sex again. And I'm like, it's not funny, actually. It's like very bad that we're all just creating normalcy around being intoxicated for sex with men. By the way, for women, that's like very unsafe, you know, like but it was things like that that I didn't feel at the time that I could speak to. But over time, I started to be like, I actually think this is pretty fucked up. Like, maybe we should change this cultural norm. And then right around the time that I was sort of having that awakening, Donald Trump came on the scene, and I was like, are you serious? Like, all this stuff that I feel like I've been unpacking is now on my daily news brief every day. And it was just like having to relive it and sort of like an I told you so. Like, I had been talking about this for a while, and like, I don't know, people just thought it was like, oh, funny, whatever, it is funny. Like, I write in a humorous way, but it's also very dangerous. And I think we see that now, right? It's very dangerous because it's so insidious, and it like creeps and crawls through all of culture. Yeah.
And
Well,
go ahead, Daniela.
I just want to say, like, one thing that's really been fascinating to me as you're talking is like, when we were saying earlier, like, it's all the same. It's like we had the same trauma. We acted it out in very similar ways,
Yeah.
even though it was coming from a different place, right? Like, yours was purity culture, mine was pedophilia culture. But like, it's still, right, being a young child, being a developing human being, and like having your whole world be about sex and all of these things, it's so marking of you in such a way. And, as you were talking, like, it's so funny because I had the opposite feeling. I was like, no, I am self-assured. I'm done with that craziness. I own my body. I make the choices. And then it wasn't until I'm, actually a grown adult that's a lot more healed, and I'm going back and writing about some of that stuff, that I'm like, oh no, I was, kind of participating in this same risky behavior.
Yeah.
And anyways, I just like, this parallel is very strong to me, and I like appreciate you writing the book that like talks about that stuff, right?
Yeah.
Because that's hard to do, and it's hard to like put yourself out there like that. But this is one of the reasons why when people are deconstructing, now in my cult book club, we do like 12 cult memoirs in a row, but it's like to notice these patterns and see
And
that
themes.
it's like,
Yeah.
these themes, these tactics that they use on us are
Mhm.
very similar. And I think, I mean, across the board, cult survivors have just said, like, when Donald Trump won, it was just like so triggering. And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
yeah,
It's
insidious.
it is. That's the word. Insidious.
Maddie, when you there's a particular quote that I pulled out here, and you use the language of social reward, and you describe it as you kept seeking a God of love, and I hoped was still there for me. And I think a lot of what those of us that are coming out of these types of cultures, what we end up feeling is that that sense of, where do I belong? What is my purpose? Because so much of our identity, and I was a pastor as well, and my identity was tied up in that. And then once I moved away from that, I'm like, what the hell do I do with my life now? And it was especially complicated because a lot of this was happening in my 40s and 50s, and not as a younger person. So talk a little bit about that aspect of it. And also, by the way, I've got to say something, and I think I pointed this out to you early on. Your experience that I think is different from most people's experience is that your family is awesome. Like,
oh yeah,
your brother and your mother and your father, and the way that they supported you on this journey, especially your brother, and the advice that he was able to give you, the wisdom that he was able to share with you. I know for most of us, that is something, that an experience that we don't have.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about the pressures to first of all, when you're moving away from that, probably the reason that you were still holding on to a lot of these residual ideas was you wanted to please your family.
Yeah.
And you didn't want to upset those relationships. I know that's been true in my case.
Yeah. I was gonna say, I'm conducting research right now, talking to women who have been evangelical married and evangelical divorced. And oh my God, shit is dark. I really do. I'm like, I told a girl last night or a woman last night, I was like, I know it's all the same as we've been discussing, Daniela, but I truly believe they had it worse than I did because they were marred in these marriages for 15 plus years, right? And the only thing that is like, or the one thing that's not a renewable resource in life is time, and they lost that time to such to lies, just straight up lies. So and many of them since leaving the marriages have not had support from their parents, and so many of them have said thank you for sharing your story because you do have support from your parents. And that is something many of us, we can never be public about our stories because it would cost us everything, and it's already costing them so much, right? And so I was lucky in that, and I talk about this also in the book. I feel like that's my catchphrase. I talk about this in the book. But at home, I learned a God of love and compassion. And so, like, that's what my parents taught me. So ultimately, this God is why I deconstructed, because what I was learning from the faith practice was directly in conflict with that in the larger world, right? These things work as long as you keep it in a tight container. But the second you go outside of that, it all kind of it all blows up pretty quickly. And so I did have this want to, and I still do. I still had this like want to be close to God, in this God of love and compassion that I felt I had a deep divine connection to at a very young age, like when I was like 14. You know, I talk about it like at theater camp is when I felt like I was really one with God. And I didn't have that language at the time, or like when I visited New York City for the first time, that's when I felt like really one with God. And so I felt like I had had these divine experiences and that connection. So I really hoped that I would still have access to that. The problem was the way that I had learned to have access to it. And what I believed is that it was that I had to be a Christian. I had to believe Jesus was the Messiah. I had to live out these certain morals, or I would no longer have access to that God. So I was sad about that, and that was really that was a grieving process. I was grieving my relationship to something that I thought was very real, but thought was also now conditional, you know? Um, and in terms of my family, I was very lucky in that, like I said, I learned a God of love and compassion. So as I started speaking out publicly about a lot of this, my parents were sort of nodding their heads in agreement. I don't think they realized how bad it was, until my older sister, who the book is dedicated to, she was really going off the rails, like deep in the dogma and dogmatic lifestyle, and just like ministry group after ministry group after ministry group. And she was miserable. And she was super judgmental. Like my parents were like, what happened to our daughter? Like, and so seeing her kind of like go off the rails like that, they were like, what have we done? Like, what did we introduce her to that like got her to this place? Because that's not how my parents were. Not that they didn't also about, like, they taught us to not have sex until we were married and all of that. I'm not gonna, and to what we were discussing before we pressed record, I definitely had pressures to look a certain way or men would not like me. I think no woman is exempt from that kind of narrative, but it's like particularly bad in the church because your whole life is about being someone's wife and being chosen. So you really better like, and then if you're not like sexy enough and they cheat on you, it's your fault, like all of that, right? So I definitely still got messages about, you know, you need to you need to look a certain way to be attractive and things like that. They weren't perfect, but they definitely weren't telling me that it would be my fault if a guy cheated on me. I want to be clear about that. It was nothing that bad, but I did still have a lot of pressure to like look and be a certain size. Um and it all went back to being like chosen by men. But my parents got really screwed over by our church that we were part of for like 15 years. And my dad basically got like unjustifiably pushed out. And once that happened, my mom, being the woman she is, who never wanted to be a preacher's wife to begin with, um, she was like, you got to figure something else out. Like, I am not spending the rest of my life, what years we have left, being a preacher's wife. This is unstable. You don't have retirement. I want to retire soon. I want to travel. Like, I don't want to do this anymore. And so my dad took a total career pivot. He was like selling insurance for like $35,000 a year or something in like his 50s. And now he has an amazing job and works in education. He works for the Missouri, he works for a grant program through Mizzou that helps enrichment for schools all over Missouri. But anyway, so I was lucky in that right as I was going through a lot of my stuff, my parents got really burned by the church. And Donald Trump happened. And they were appalled. And
Yeah.
they were like, I cannot believe this. And so I did. And look, listen, I don't want to call people stupid, but I had smart parents. My parents valued education and they taught us to think critically. I don't think most parents care about that with their kids. They care about obedience. They
Yeah.
care about, you need to make us look good. That was
Yeah.
not my parents' parenting ethic at all. My parents' parenting ethic was, we teach you to be the best humans you can be so that you can contribute well to society. And part of that is questioning, being curious, learning how to gather knowledge and think and thinking critically. And so, and imparting compassion, always cheering for the underdog. Like, these are things that my parents lived out in their lives. So it was easier to like emulate. But yeah, I know not everybody is that lucky.
This this thing that you said, I think, is really important because that is kind of the difference. It's like the cult sells you this idea, right? This idea of
Mhm.
perfectly groomed children standing in
Yep.
a row, never speaking out, and
Yes.
I got the daughter I deserved, right? Like, I got the
Mhm.
daughter that refused to breathe for 7 minutes because she just wasn't gonna be rushed, okay? And she's been that kid since day one. And
Yeah.
my husband and I always joke that, like, the hardest part of parenting is that she doesn't have a good soldier mode to snap into.
Mhm.
Meanwhile,
Mhm.
I think that, like, the almost like superpower that all of us cult babies have is the I can do it with a broken heart,
Yeah.
no matter what is going on, when it is showtime, we can go, right?
That
And
is
it's
such a good
safe and
point.
it's
Yeah.
acting and it's back for us. But it's also like this almost like survival skill that we learned because
Yeah.
we were being judged on, so like when you're being raised in a cult or by this like works and obedience, like that's the opposite of unconditional love. And
Yes, exactly.
you were getting unconditional love from your parents, right? Which
Yeah.
means
Yeah.
they're going to have to like reaffirm you as individuals. And
Yeah.
so, by the way, it doesn't surprise me that your dad eventually ran afoul, right? Because that's
Right.
one of the things about cults, too, is like the cult never cares more about operational success than about
Mhm.
control, right? Like the control is part of the point. So even if you
Yeah.
have like a loving, affirming leader, but he's not controlling people enough, like you said, it all falls apart, right? If you get too far outside of that. But
That is
also
such a good
just
point. Yeah.
so much credit to your parents, right? Like I also am very lucky that I had a mother who like affirmed me being
Mhm.
me, like through
Mhm.
this deconstruction journey. And it makes a huge difference. I mean,
Mhm.
I have so many, and we're going to have so many listeners now that like, it's almost like they vicariously want to hear your story because they're
Yeah.
never going to get that kind of support from their parents.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is heartbreaking. I almost, it's like I can understand it, but I can't really understand it. But I do. I mean, I made a video about this. Like, if your definition of love is so conditional and wrathful, which is God, which is the Christian God, right? Like, at its core, it is do what I say or I will burn you in hell. Believe how I said or I'll burn you in hell for eternity. For eternity.
Yeah.
Then if that is love, that is your definition of love, then no wonder so many parents can stomach their gay kids committing suicide because they're like, no, well, if I would have accepted him and actually loved him, that would have been worse than them committing suicide. Like, the disconnect is insane to me, but I get it because like I was in it. So I understand that.
Yeah. I
The
saw
most
this
loving
meme.
thing you can do is like convert someone.
I saw this meme that said the Christian asked the atheist, so what if you die and God is real? And the atheist said, I'll give him a chance to apologize.
Yeah.
You know? It's
That's
just kind of
great.
like, this is kind of the realization I had, right? Because I was just
Yeah.
thrown out at 15, right? So I was just like, oh, well, I never really believed it all anyways, right? I'm going off. But then eventually, like, you still have to come back and ask yourself, like, what do you believe and what do you everything? Yeah. And you have that what if, right? Because that's, again, we're raised in fear. If you don't do right, so what if? And eventually I was like, if I die after everything I have suffered in the name of God and being a generally good person, like, and my biggest sin is I didn't believe in you and you're going to throw me in hell for everything I've suffered in your name. Like, I don't want that God, right? Like,
Oh my God. Yeah. My joke is, if heaven is full of evangelicals and Donald Trump and hell is like the Fab Five and like Lady Gaga, like send me straight to hell in a 2-piece, baby. Like belly button out and all. It's hot down there. And then in terms of my brother, I know we have to wrap up in a few, but in terms of my brother, I got lucky in that Derek, I just said his real name. He's Eddie in the book. He's much older than me, so he had kind of gone through a lot of this already. And he kind of got the black sheep thing out of the way for me. I have to give him so much gratitude for that. Because he just like bucked the system so much with my parents that based on like him, I was like, there is literally nothing I can do to break my parents. Like, he has been a shithead and has contended so much of their teachings and whatever, and they still love him. They love him so much. And so I was just kind of like, great. And I knew he could be, a resource. And he was an invaluable resource to me.
It is a fantastic book, and I encourage everyone to read it. And Maddie, I'm going to ask you this as we conclude. You have entire chapters dedicated to your experiences with rich people, and one of the early stories one of the early jobs that you had, you were you basically just returned this rich woman's shit all the time. It's like you went to the store and it's like she wanted you to return it. So the question, you can tell that story if you'd like, but the question is, what did you discover about rich people? And generally where all of us are raised in the world, we think of rich people as someone, who drives a nice car, lives in a nice house, but you were actually around rich people. Yes.
Yeah, I say it a bit tongue in cheek because when you call rich people, they get very uncomfortable. It's like, I think they want to be called something else. And I'm like, well, you just are. Like, that is what you are, like whatever. But yeah, no, I do have strong feelings about it because I'm like, no, you think like this guy in Texas who like has a nice house and has a nice car and like can send his 3 kids to private Christian school and whatever they're going to go to UT, blah, blah, blah. No, that guy is not rich. I literally work for the 1%, like the 1% to the 0.01%. These motherfuckers are rich. And it has, if anything, made me far more liberal because I'm just like, no one needs this much money. Anyway, no, but it is complex. I will say, like, what are things that I've learned from rich people and about rich people? at our core, like, people are people. And yes, while it appears very different in what they are going through, and you kind of like, there are so many times in my life and my jobs where I've just had to like nod my head and be like, this is a rich people problem. Like, this is not a real problem. This is a rich people problem. But at our core, everyone is still asking the same questions. What is my purpose? Why am I here? And for people who have everything, um, they, especially if it's not like their wealth, like what they worked for necessarily. So, say it's like the spouse of the person who made the money or the kids of the person who made the money, um, they live in a deeply insecure place, um, because they know none of it was actually earned, that they're never going to have to really struggle. And there's really, in my opinion, there's no satisfaction without struggle, because the whole reason you value something is because you know what it took to get there. So I think it's just a lot of insecurity that is expressing itself in really messed up power dynamics and structure. Um, I will also say that a lot of rich people are so generous and so kind and so supportive, and they just want to do whatever they can to help people. And they're like driving the arts. They are, any, like, they do have their hands in lots of things, right? And so that was really fun to learn. Like, wow, actually, like, someone having money doesn't make them an asshole. They were just an asshole, and they either have money or they don't have money. um but I also, in terms of like what I've learned, there are definitely things that are cultural. um I don't know what it is, but like, and this isn't all, but a lot of rich people are just like, their kids' lives are like very, very, very scheduled all the time. Like, there's no room for play, pretending, entertaining yourself. Like, they are just constantly controlled and like overlooked, and overlooked meaning like uh surveillanced
Yeah.
essentially. And I don't know, like, I think one thing that always got on my nerves as like a child care provider is I was like, these kids just expect to be talked to constantly. Like, why can't they just play by themselves for 1 second? Like, I played by myself so much as a
Yep.
kid, you know.
It's
But
because we didn't have any money. We didn't have anything to play
yeah,
with.
exactly. So there are definitely like nuanced cultural things like that. I could go on and on, but I've signed NDAs and things. But I I just think at the end of the day, like, people are people. And when you are who you are and you're honest about who you are, you'll find your people. So, like, actually along the way, like, I've spent so many years on the Upper West Side working for various families. So now when I walk around the Upper West Side, I run into families all the time. Joe, we've missed you. And their kids are like teenagers now, and it's like, and I've gotten to really be a part of these kids' lives. And so I don't know. I do feel like a lot of those families became my New York family. You know, I do feel that, but there has also been plenty of like, oh my God, no one needs this much money. That's not every family that I've worked for, but there are some families that I'm just like, why and how. Like, I'm
Yeah.
just genuinely curious how. Yeah, so
And which is going to be covered probably by Daniela in your forthcoming book, The Culting of America, right? Because capitalism is a big cult, is it not?
yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
this is part of the problem, is that,
Mhm.
I think actually I came to it in my chapter about us versus them mentality, is that with
Mhm.
America, the problem is we are new is better and old, more is always better, bigger is
Mhm.
always better, right? So it's just this
Mhm.
like, you know, uh
Mhm.
another thing I heard recently was like, if it was anything other than money, we would call that hoarding and classify that
Mm-hmm.
as like a mental disorder, right? When you're talking about billionaires and mega millionaires,
Right.
where it's just like, if that was any other thing in the world, even like physical, actual gold, it would be like this
Mm-hmm.
problem. Yeah. Um,
Yeah. And
but
I can't even understand, like, with how much I know things cost, right? Like, we know things cost a lot, like inflation. Um, but even with that, I'm like, I really think if everyone made like $500,000 a year, everyone would be doing more than okay. Like, I don't understand why anyone would need any more money than that. Like, I just don't, like, even at my most successful, I'm like, I don't think that I will, like, what more could I possibly do other than, I don't know, build, like, start other foundations, whatever. But then it's like, again, they all have these like charities and stuff that they start because it's a tax write off. And it's just like, I mean, I'm glad that it is going into something, but like, I don't know that we need privatized charity in that way, like that being the main form of social support in our country is reliance on super wealthy people for their charitable philanthropic services. Like, oh man,
the opposite. Yeah, that's the
that's not
opposite
great.
of what a developed
Yeah.
nation is supposed to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to be fair, like, I don't think these people are like bad people. I really don't. But it is like a genuine question of mine of like, I just, why? Like, why do you need X, like 7 to 10 multi-million dollar properties that you only ever spend max 2 months at a time in? I can't understand it, you know? But maybe it's because I was raised by a preacher and a teacher.
It's a great book. I encourage everyone to
Thank
read it.
you.
God, Sex, and Rich People. Maddie, if someone wants to support you, follow you, buy the book, how do they do that?
So follow me at Maddie Jo Cowsert on Instagram. I hate that this is a thing, but like follows do matter. I've been like ranting about it on my stories later recently, but follows do matter. I also just and on my website, maddiejocowsert.com/book. There's the option there. If you want to order a book, a signed book, you can order it directly from me. Just shoot me a DM on Instagram and we'll get that arranged. And also, I just recently launched a free 5-day email course called A Guide to Post Purity Culture Dating. Crap, I don't even know what it's called. It's Dating After Purity Culture. I just launched it. I just finished it. But it's datingafterpurityculture.com. And yeah, it's a guide to getting great dates and dick coming out of purity culture. And it's free. So you can sign up there, datingafterpurityculture.com. And yeah, I think those are the essentials.
Fantastic. I know we just scratched the surface. Hopefully we can have you back sometime and continue the
Yes.
conversation. It's been great, Maddie. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Follow
much.
follow Daniela as well. To all of
Yes,
our
I will.
listeners, buy her book, Uncultured. It's a great read as well. And thank you all for joining us. And until next time, I'm Scott Lloyd for Daniela Mestinek Young. We'll see you on the next episode of Cults and the Culting of America.